Why okay sucks, but terrible is normal and acceptable. Sounds like a really strange contrast, but it turns out it's not. So this video was motivated by an online discussion that started with a small misquote of a statement I have to make. And that statement is, okay sucks. The misquote was that okay is next door to sucks, which does come from a longer explanation of saying okay sucks, but the quote is okay sucks. From there, in part because it started with a misquote, the discussion really went sideways. And largely the reason it went sideways because the people in the conversation didn't understand the original quote or the mountain of information behind it and what it's really getting at. So they kind of ran off with it in a totally different direction than it has anything to do with. I'd like to clear up some of that confusion and misunderstanding, because the core idea behind okay sucks explains why most behavioral remediation doesn't work or only works poorly. And it explains why so many people in competitive sports never even get to where they compete, or they do poorly, they're not truly competitive, or maybe they kind of struggle to get by and they're kind of mediocre and they get a title or two that they're working on, but the dog never really does well, often in spite of the fact that they have a really talented dog. In this online conversation, the idea that okay is next door to sucks was kind of it was totally misinterpreted as a way of being unsupportive of people who are struggling to learn something, to help their dog to get better and whatnot. And absolutely, there's nothing at all unsupportive about TBTE, training between the ears. I definitely think it's the most supportive training system out there. And we intentionally created to be thus. But not surprising that somebody would hear that and think, well, that's kind of harsh. And aren't you kind of crapping on people who are, just learning, or they're doing their best or whatever? And the answer is no, not at all. In fact, the statement has nothing to do with those people. It has to do with concepts behind training. How do we organize training? How do we conceive training? How do we actually enact training? And how do we do it where we can begin with a very troubled dog and a very unskilled owner, somebody who's not some fabulous dog trainer, whatever, and we can be the surest we could be of getting to a really fabulous result. In TBTE, this system can be used for competition. That's where I originally kind of put together a lot of my ideas from it. But we're not using competitive techniques that you would typically see. This is a big problem in training in general. A lot of trainers trying to teach the average owner to train in a way that the typical competitive trainer trains. And they don't have the dog for it, and they don't have the skills for it. And usually, you're only working with these people for some kind of condensed time period, and you're trying to get them to accomplish something that's really huge. So in TBT, most of our work is about behavioral remediation, taking dogs that have extreme fear, aggression, reactivity, hyperactivity, whatever it might be, and not teaching those dogs to be like competitive dogs in the sense that they're doing this great obedience or anything else. In fact, in most of TBT, we don't teach obedience at all. We have some great methods for teaching obedience, but my core feeling is that obedience is the wrong thing to be teaching pet dogs. All of us have seen, or maybe owned, dogs that are really great pet dogs, and they've never been trained, and they don't ever really need training. They're not great dogs because they sit every time somebody tells them to sit, or they lay down every time somebody tells them to lay down, or they'll do a recall from 800 yards away, or they can heel between a bunch of trash barrels or people, whatever. they're just really great dogs because they're emotionally coming from a really good place, and they see the world in a way that is friendly and calm and works out well for them. And in most of TBT, if we're not talking about helping people with competitive training or with specific other task-oriented things like some parts of service dog training where we're trying to teach the dog to do a particular thing, generally what we're doing is what could best be called untraining. We're teaching dogs how to feel well in the world, do well in the world, and have a comfortable life with their owners because we change how they view the world and how they feel about it and how they feel internally. So in doing this, to try and take a dog from wherever it's starting to some really great point. So let's just say, typical dog that we work with is very reactive to one thing or another, probably not very good in public, although it might be great in some circumstances. It might do really well in doggy daycare or something like that. Maybe does really well out on pack walks, but it's still basically an unmitigated disaster in other areas. And the dog's problems are really, really eating away at the quality of life of the dog and of the family that the dog lives with. So how does okay sucks have anything to do with this? Well, the statement okay sucks is not just about a result, but it's more about the learning pathway that affects the result. But let's talk about it just as a result for a moment. One of the most common things that happens when people talk to me, whether they're professional trainers talking to me about a client dog they're working with, or it's an owner talking about their dog, they will talk about often things the dog does very well. Oh, the dog's great at this, he loves this, whatever it might be. Or they'll talk a lot about the dog is okay. Very common thing would be somebody calls me up, their dog has bitten 5 times, let's say. Not horrible bites, not great. But the dog was upset with strangers. And the dog will say, well, she's okay with strangers, once she gets to know them. Or she's pretty good with most people, but... Well, those are versions of why okay sucks. Because in spite of everything the dog does well, it's bitten 5 times. Or we may have a dog that's just a wonderful, wonderful dog, but has really bad separation anxiety. And it does such damage to the house or to itself that, I've had clients that call me up, they haven't left the house in 3 years. One of them at a time will go do something, but the couple together has not left the house in years because of this. Well, in spite of all the good stuff that the dog does, what it's having a problem with is ruining its life. So, very common that people will say, oh, my dog's okay, or it's okay about this, and yet it's got this huge life-crushing problem. In fact, a funny story relating to competition. I had some friends of mine that went to a competition about 500 miles away from where we live. A lot of expense in going to that competition, the travel and everything, time off from work, etc. But they were doing this because it's a type of competition that doesn't happen very often. It's a particular canine sport. And their dogs had some really significant problems before they went. And I had suggested to them about 8 weeks before that they really reorganize their thinking about their training and really change some things. And basically they said, well, our dogs are okay at most stuff, and I don't want to make a change now. We'll go do the trial, see how the dogs do, and then, we can start afresh after the trial. So I remember going out to the training field, a couple days after the trial, the 2 guys had come back, and I said to one of them, I said, hey, how was the trial? And he's like, oh, it's great, I had a great time, blah, blah, and on. I was like, oh, how'd your dog do? Oh, it's okay, And I said, well, like, what do you score, He goes, oh, we failed. Well, I was failing okay. Failing sucks. What if that was a service dog? And instead of the trial, we were going out to dinner with some family and friends who'd come in from out of town. And what we've trained our dog for is to be able to behave well and enjoyably when we go out in public and when we go to dinner and whatnot. Well, I mean, suppose the dog, has made a little bite on some kid going by, and maybe we have a great explanation for, why it wasn't the dog's fault, because it was really weird, and the kid did this and that, and just before that, somebody had dropped a whole tray full of dishes, and it made a lot of noise, and that kind of scared my dog. Well, in the end, really the only thing that's going to matter is the dog bit a kid. And so your dog didn't do, well, maybe he did okay, depending on your definition, but what he did sucked, right? So what we have to think about is if we're taking that service dog out in public, it has to do fabulous. This would be the equivalent of my friend having gone to the trial. And by the way, the other one came back and said pretty much the same thing. How'd your dog do? He didn't say, oh, he failed. He's like, oh, it was okay, but he failed. What our dog has to do, our service dog out in that restaurant has to do, is the equivalent of these guys going to their trial and literally scoring excellent. Not just, way we squeaked by, we got a passing score, did better in some things than others. Our service dog needs to do excellent. Our pet dog that's afraid of the world, that we're trying to rehabilitate and get to where he does really great, that's our goal. It should be that he does great. Not that he's okay with some things and others he's still terrible and blah, blah, blah. That would be normal somewhere along the process, depending on how we think about that. But our goal should be that our fearful dog becomes, to the greatest degree possible, bold and comfortable with the world. And if that's our goal, then we have to have a pathway to get there. So let's start by talking about something that we use as a mainstay of our training in TBTE, which is called the grade school model. And let's think about two kids. In this case, let's say they're twins, and they're going into first grade together. And they're both, as far as the parents can tell, about equally bright. But as they go into math classes, the one child, let's call him Tom, does really well right from the beginning. His first test, he gets an A on. But his brother, Steve, he gets a C or a C minus, and he struggles some. Well, for the next week or the next couple of days, typically the class is going to be aimed at trying to help the kids who didn't get really strong scores do better. What did they not understand? What did they not know? And can we help them get better? That's a very natural process. Now, of course, what was our first kid? We got Steve. Let's go with Bob. Say the first one was Bob. So we got Bob and Steve. I'll try to remember that. Bob, of course, pretty much already understands what the teacher's going to be talking about for the next couple of days. So doesn't really need a lot of help with that. But Steve does need a lot of help with it. And if the teacher does a good job and Steve is capable enough and he applies himself, he pays attention and whatnot, does his homework, he should get to where when they take a test again on that same material, he'll also get an A, maybe an A minus, right? But if he's getting a C, C plus, then he didn't really learn the stuff that well. He's got a little bit of a grasp on it. And now what's going to happen the next week or a few days later is the whole class is going to move on to another element of whatever kind of math they're doing. And let's say that Bob, again, gets an A or an A minus on the test. And Steve, again, gets a C or a C minus. Well, we're going to repeat this whole same thing. Now, one element that is failing in a lot of training is that for a variety of reasons, we don't help Steve get from the C minus to an A. Steve should be able to completely understand that material. How long it would take him and how much help he would need, who knows? It's going to vary from student to student. But because the teacher is teaching 25 or 30 kids, they teach for a certain amount of time and then they move on. Well, what happens as this continues to go on is The two kids are sitting at home and they're talking about, oh, tomorrow, we have a new math test coming up. And how do they feel about this? Well, Bob feels great about it. He's gotten an A or an A minus on every test he's taken. He expects he's going to do just as well on this one. So he's not very stressed by it. What does Steve think? Steve's like, oh, God, another math test. He knows that he's going to struggle in the test itself, that there's going to be stuff on there he's not going to do well, and he's going to feel stressed and uncomfortable with that. And he pretty much expects the grade he gets back isn't going to be that good, and that doesn't feel well. He doesn't feel well thinking about that he's going to get back a C or a C minus, and when he imagines getting it, he imagines feeling crappy. And then, of course, when he does get it, he feels crappy. Oh, like these people are getting B's and these people are getting A's, and my brother, who I really don't think is that much smarter than me, is getting A's. And by this point, he's probably starting to give me crap about it, and that doesn't feel very good to me. So what's important to understand here is these two kids are not having the same experience in learning. Well, in dog training terms, Bob is the equivalent of a dog that gets taken to an obedience class, but he doesn't have any emotional problems with anything. He feels really great going into that space. He's like, oh, wow, this is cool. Look, there's other dogs, there's new people. This is awesome. I really like this. He doesn't really even need to be in that class. He'd probably be a perfectly good pet without it. Arguably, he'll be a better pet with it. And of course, if the class was about trying to learn how to do some kind of competitive thing, like let's say nose work or rally obedience or whatever it might be, he's going to have an easy time with this. And so is his owner, and he's going to do well. Steve, on the other hand, walks into the classroom, and maybe even before he gets there, he's kind of disturbed by the car ride. He didn't really like getting in the car. Maybe he threw up partway there, because his stomach got upset. Now he's going into this classroom with all these new sights and sounds and smells. There's new dogs and there's new people. And he just threw up 10 minutes ago. Well, how great is he feeling going into this? And so now, the teacher is going to try to teach Steve how to do stuff. And maybe they're going to teach Steve with rewards. If Steve is actually a dog, let's say food. Well, he just threw up. How excited does he feel about food? And he's very disturbed by the presence of the other dogs and the barking and the smells and the new people. And he's afraid. Well, that fear could block his ability to access the rewards. The thing that seems really good to us, I'm like, hey, look, Steve, we got a piece of food for you. His stomach's already turning. He's not going to feel great about that. Maybe he's in a different class and the trainer uses some kind of moderate or gentle force to train the dog. And so we're going to teach him to walk with us by, pulling him along on the leash. And I don't know, maybe we have a choke collar on and we're making little pops because he's not with us. Maybe we just have something soft like a martingale. And it's just, he's at the end of the leash and he's getting kind of dragged along a little bit. And if he improves and comes along, we give him an attaboy. Oh, good boy, Steve. But probably the person doing this with him is completely new to him, and he's afraid of new people anyway. Well, does he think their attaboy is like the greatest thing on earth? And he's like, yay, they told me attaboy. I feel great. So whether we're talking about the actual dogs or we're talking about the humans, the pathway in the learning experience is extremely important. And what we can kind of think about is two pathways to success, the success that we want. And one pathway, and the one being argued for by the person who was bringing up this conversation about my quote, not the person who made the quote, somebody was responding to it, was what I would call the crappy to great pathway. We're going to start out crappy because everything starts crappy, unless you just happen to have an exceptional student. If somebody's bringing a dog to me because it's got, all kinds of behavior problems, well, how well could it do in the beginning? It's got all these problems. But somehow we're going to go from crappy to great. And that's not a very practical thing because the pathway matters. So let's go back for a moment to Bob and Steve. Yeah, I remember their names. Let's go back to Bob and Steve and think about either of those two children when they're introduced to new information. Just in the act of being presented with new information, they are going to tend to feel very differently. Bob is going to tend to feel forward-leaning, interested, curious, like, good, I love learning, because I do well at it. How many people love anything they do poorly at? I never heard anybody say, well, probably comes up some, but rarely do you hear somebody say, oh, I really suck at X, but I love it. Usually people say, oh, I hate X because I suck at it. And that's true. But let's take Steve now. We say to Steve, hey, we've got something new for you to learn. Well, just us saying that could be depressing to him. And it could tend to make him withdraw some and shut down. Because the learning process is uncomfortable to him because he fails a lot. He does crappy. And even though his teachers help him move from, maybe his initial C minus to a B plus or even an A minus, right? He never learns to love the learning process, and he expects that he will not do well at new things. Therefore, he dislikes the idea of new things. What was the restaurant when the dog went to the restaurant for the first time? That particular restaurant. It was a new thing. Do we want to have a dog that goes in there feeling like Bob? Oh, this is great. I haven't been here before. I haven't smelled all these things. It's a little different. This is exciting. I like this. Or do we want our dog to be like Steve? Oh, man, a new place, new things. I know my owner's just going to be yelling at me and telling me I'm wrong all the time and telling me to get back on place again and again. And shush, don't do this and don't do that. Oh, man, I wish we'd just stay at home tonight. Well, which dog would you rather have? And I think maybe more importantly, which dog would you rather be? The pathway matters. So here's a really important thing to think about. If we have a legitimate first grade math student, by that I mean they've basically only learned math in school, and they haven't been given any outside instruction beyond that. And we give them a first grade test. Well, they're going to score something on it. Maybe it's going to be like our friend Steve, and it's going to be a C minus. Maybe it's going to be like our friend Bob, and it's going to be an A. But if they're actually an engaged, functional student, it's pretty unlikely it's going to be a D or an F. And even with an F, most kids who get an F did not get a 0. They got some things. They got some things right. That would be much more common. And of course, if we got a D is a lousy grade. I mean, you really don't understand something that well, and you're not that comfortable if you got a D. But a D in most scoring systems would require that you got 65 or above. Usually 65 to 70 would be a D. But what if we took either of these students and we gave them a 5th grade math test? What would they score? Well, initially people will say, well, Bob's going to score better than Steve, because he always has, and he's better at math. Guess what? He's not. He's going to get the exact same score as Steve. And here again, ask people for a score. Well, maybe they'll get a 30 or 40. No, they won't. They'll get a 0. They totally don't understand what the questions are. They have no means by which to figure out the answer because their grade school level is first grade. They may be very bright, and we certainly expect that when they're in 5th grade, they will do reasonably well to very well. Now, with what we know right now, if we forwarded 5 years or 4 years, I guess, to when Bob and Steve are in 5th grade, well, then we could ask questions about how do you think they'll do then, right? Probably very similar. Bob's probably still knocking out the A's. Steve is probably still struggling. Hopefully he's done well enough that he has passed each grade. But Steve is going to be math phobic. If somebody asks him, like, hey, how do you feel about math? They're like, ooh, not that good. I had a young woman I was talking with the other day. I was out at an airport, and her mom said that the daughter, who was about 18 at the time, I think, maybe 19, really loves the idea of flying and thinks she'd like to be a pilot. But she's never flown on a plane, so she's not really sure. Right? And I said to her, well, how do you feel about math? And she said, I hate math. Well, I didn't share this with her, but flying is a nonstop math exam. This is one math problem after another after another. And so she's probably not that likely to enjoy flying, although she might enjoy some forms of flying that are not math heavy. Like, for instance, flying ultralight planes is not particularly math heavy. If you're going to get into normal traditional flying of small planes and multi-engine planes and that kind of thing, it becomes very math heavy. But she could possibly have been put through a different pathway in her learning of math that she would feel completely different about math. And she wouldn't say, oh, I hate math, or I fail at math all the time, whatever else. She'd go, oh, yeah, no, I'm good at math. And so what would that pathway be? How would it be different? But keep in mind, as we talk about this, that both of the first graders, when given the first grade test, will not only fail, they'll get a 0 because they haven't been taught any of the information they need to understand how to do that. So if the crappy to great pathway isn't a great idea, and of course the big hope in the crappy to great pathway is that, we'll go from crappy to mediocre to good to great. Rarely happens. How about a different pathway? How about a pathway that we would call the excellent to excellent pathway? What if we could do something that would make it so that Steve only ever got A's and B's? Wouldn't he feel differently about math and what he was learning? But how could you do that? Would you just give him soft grades? You just go, well, points for trying, and hey, you brushed your teeth and your hair today, so we give you points for that. No, there's an incredibly simple solution to this, but it's a solution you have to stick to like glue. And that solution is about the grade school model. It is that we only ask Steve to do things that he's prepared to do well. And so we don't give him the same test as Bob, because Bob's ready for that test. Steve is not. So what we do is we find out, what is Steve capable of doing really well? There's got to be something. If he got the C on that first grade test, well, he must know some things that allowed him to do that. As an example, he must know probably at least how to count from 1 to 10, maybe beyond that. Okay? He almost certainly could look at a grouping of blocks between 1 and 10 and tell us how many blocks are there. 1, 3, 5, 7, 10, whatever it might be. And if I said to him, showing him those blocks, hey, if I take one of those away and I physically reach down and pick that block up and move it away, how many are left? Do you think you could get an A on that little mini quiz? Well, almost certainly. You're going to go, well, there's 9. Now, maybe what he needed to do at that level was to recount the blocks that are there. Maybe he couldn't intuitively go, oh yeah, if you took the one away, there'd be 9. Well, that's okay. Not everybody starts at that point. But if I continue to work with him with these blocks, and then I show him on paper that there's a different way of representing this problem. I could start with the number 10 drawn on the paper. I could put a sign that means minus, and then I could put underneath that a symbol that means 1. And under that or beside it, I could put a symbol that means equals. And now I could show him how these things are represented in the real world. I could say, see these 10 blocks? That's represented by this number 10 here. This 10 represents the exact same thing as this. This minus sign represents me taking one away. And so I reach down and I remove a block. And then I say this upright line here is a 1. That represents the 1 block. And then the equal represents the question. What do I have left if I take 1 away from 10? Well, I think it's pretty likely if Steve was getting a C or C minus in his early tests in first grade math, that if we did that training level with him, he'd do very, very well. In fact, what we might find out is this is too easy for him. And he answers these things extremely quickly, and he gets a little bit frustrated that we keep asking similar level questions or problems. Pretty quickly he may go, yeah, I get it. I know the numbers 1 through 10 and I can draw them. I know what they mean. And now that you explain to me, I get that the minus symbol means taking them away. And, oh yeah, the equals means what do I have left afterwards. I get all that. Okay, then we're not going to repeat that level of instruction again and again. If we do, we would actually start to frustrate him about the learning process. So what we have to figure out is what level of help and instruction does Steve need to do extremely well? That when we find that grade school level for him, he can do that very well. And so he learns from it. He needs maybe a little bit of help, but really quickly he's like, yeah, I got that. That's easy for me. Well, if we did that, that's hard to do in a class of 25 people, but if we could do that, what we might find is that there's a point at which Steve conceptually catches up with Bob, and now we could just mainstream him. We could put him in the classes and he would do very well. Or that might not be the case. It might be that he always needs more filling in of the pieces, what we would call more steps, training things in smaller steps. But in any case, when he, 4 years later, gets to 5th grade, he will now have had a track record of only doing very well in math. And so somebody asked him, how do you do in math? Especially if he didn't know that other people took other pathways, if he thought this was just a normal thing. When somebody asked him, how do you do in math? He goes, oh, great math. I learn it easily. I get A's all the time. I'm awesome. What was the difference? The difference was the pathway. So by following the grade school model, we only taught Steve at a level that he could learn easily and that he would tend to do very well very quickly. And so his impression of learning and of himself was radically different than when we had him in the traditional pathway. So in the traditional pathway, C minus is okay, but it sucks. We want to get A's constantly. We want excellent. We want the excellent to excellent pathway. And the only challenge to getting there is for us as the teacher to figure out what level of instruction the student needs to constantly do extremely well. Now, there was another part to the statement that I made there, which was, in the beginning, okay, sucks, but terrible is normal and acceptable. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? Well, how did the two kids do on their 5th grade math test when they were in 1st grade? They got zeros. Isn't that a terrible score? But it's normal. That's what a 1st grader should get when presented with information they're not ready for. And it's completely acceptable that they get that 0. Now, once they're in 5th grade, it would be terrible if they got a 0. And it wouldn't be normal, and it wouldn't be acceptable. So how does this relate to our dogs? Well, if I have a dog that the main thing I'm trying to help the dog with, let's say, is fear. The crappy to great pathway would say, well, you're going to take the dog out someplace and he's going to be afraid of everything. And, you're going to talk nice to him and whatnot. Maybe you'll give him some food. And And if you keep repeating this, he'll get better. Well, the absolute reality is it's often not true. There are just millions of people in the world who have repeated things their dog does poorly at with great effort and great conviction. And a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, the dog still does very poorly at those things. It may have learned some more skills. It may know how to sit a little better, down a little better, or whatever else, but it can't do them in difficult environments because it's afraid. And all of that learning, sit and down and heel, didn't really get the dog over its fear. It maybe does okay now. It does better than it did before, but better is so bad that it doesn't really matter. The dog still can't go out to the restaurant, still can't go with us on vacation, still can't go visit our family, still can't have strangers come in the house, whatever it may be. How would the excellent to excellent pathway work? Well, very simple. We would start training the dog in an environment where it has the least fear that it could possibly have, whatever that might be for that dog. Some dogs, no matter where you put them, they're going to be experiencing a lot of fear. But some places are going to be less so than others. And within that environment, we could start teaching them therapeutic interactions and responses that start to help them feel differently. And only when they're doing excellent within this easiest environment we could do it in, would we expose them to a more challenging environment. And that more challenging environment should be the least increase in challenge that we could create. That would be ideal. So now when we take the dog into that new environment, or we change something within its environment, which is much more likely what we would do, we're now going to go back to the earliest, easiest things we taught that dog and do those kind of interactions, whatever those might be. I'm not here to teach about those particular things today, but we would do those things. And what in all likelihood to happen if we made a small enough change in the environment is the dog go, oh, it's an easy day. We're back to that stuff. I did that weeks ago and I'm great at it. And what the dog would be learning is, I am great at it in spite of this change that you made in the environment. And that's the core thing we're trying to teach the dog, not the specifics of what we're actually trying to get the dog to do. Sit down and whatever else. Also part of why I don't worry about sitting down and whatever else. Okay, so sounds like a great idea, but Mark, I live in the real world. And I live in a townhouse. I live in an apartment. There's stuff that goes on all the time that I cannot shield my dog from. And so therefore I have to train the dog in those environments. Well, the reality is you don't. If, let's say you were the parent who had to take your kid to school for the day, they were going to give your first grader a 5th grade test. Well, you could handle that a lot of ways. One way is you could have a meltdown. You could imagine the stress your child is going to feel at being subjected to this failure, that they're going to be asked this test that they don't know anything on. They're going to feel like crap. They're going to be told afterwards they got a 0 and they did poorly. And you could really, really stress out about that. And that'd be pretty normal. Not helpful, not productive, but it'd be pretty normal. But there's another way you could look at it, another way you could think about it, which is you could say to your child, hey, we're going to school today, and I don't know exactly why, but they're doing this really crazy thing. And they're doing it with a bunch of kids. They're going to give you a test that you won't know anything on it. When you look at the questions, you won't even understand what they're about. Don't worry about it. That's just the way the test is. They're doing this for their benefit to get some information they're going to use for things that don't matter to us. So don't be stressed by the idea that you go in there and they're going to give you a test that the only thing you understand on it is what's your name, right? That's the way it's supposed to be. And so this is really going to be one of the easiest days you have, because going in, you don't know the answers to the questions. You don't have to worry about them. Don't stress about them. And when you come out, I'll be here waiting for you, and we're going to go get an ice cream to celebrate that you did your thing. Yeah. Now, could we, in dog training, do that same thing as far as telling the dog student that kind of story. No, not really. There are some interesting things we could do in that direction, but fundamentally we can't do that. But what we can do is we can tell the owner. They are also the one being tested because they're taking their dog into some environment, or they're living with their dog in some environment that is beyond the dog's grade school level, that is too difficult and it's going to fail. And what we can tell them is, hey, this sucks, but there is no magic answer for this. What is beyond your dog's grade school level and maybe beyond your grade school level as a person just is. And there's no magic trick you're going to be able to do to succeed with that. Now, this is to some degree where schools have thought about training collide, because in force-based training, they kind of feel like, well, if you had to be there, you just up the force. You don't tolerate the bad behavior. You just use more force if you need to. The best force-based trainers would not do that. They'd say if you could avoid that circumstance, avoid it. If you can't avoid it, maybe change the way the equipment's on the dog or something so he realizes this is not training time and it doesn't count and you just get through it. Of course, reward-based trainers realize that if what I'm doing is using rewards to help the dog succeed, we'll just naturally run into failure at a certain level because the dog can't take the food. It's too difficult for him. And the same would be true if we were using play rewards or whatever else. At a certain point, the test is too difficult. So we can't tell the dog that they're going to fail and it's okay. But we can tell the owner. And we can tell the owner, don't stress about this. Don't feel that you're a failure. Don't feel that you're supposed to have a magic answer to this question. You don't. Your dog's going to go out and act like a nut. Your job is to hold on to the leash, get through the difficulty as calmly as you can, and don't bitch at your dog and try to tell him he's wrong or try to tell him he should do better or yank on the leash or whatever else. Just recognize you're just holding on to an animal that's beyond its grade school level. You can get through that thing, and when you get through it, you're going to take him out for an ice cream. You're going to do something to try to help the dog start to feel better as quickly as it can. And this is something that most training really lacks in. It's the core of TBTE. How can we help the animal to feel better? How can we mechanistically have some ability to control the animal's emotional state, and through that teach the animal how they can control their own emotional state? But if we think about training in this way, what's going to happen is we're going to counsel the owners about the things that their dog can do well now. I'm going to tell them as much as possible, don't worry about the other stuff. It sucks, but you've already been living with it for weeks, months, or years. So we're just going to deal with it. But we're going to start teaching the dog what the dog can do well. And the things that we're going to teach are things that build emotional and social skills. And then we're going to teach the dog how to be able to use those skills to feel better in the face of a very small challenge. The dog's going to do great. And they'll feel like they did great. And they'll know they did great because they got rewards for it and they can accept the rewards. They can enjoy the rewards. And we build up through doing that. And eventually, some of the things, just like the 5th grade math test, that in the beginning were impossible for the owner and the dog, now they start to fall within their grade school level. Now, that's not a completely unmanageable circumstance for the dog. And the owner has learned a lot of tools themselves, how to help the dog, and the dog has learned a lot of tools, how to be helped, and that it itself can succeed, that it can get through these things and it can feel well. And so at every step in the way as we're training, we have excellence. We also have a lot of terrible. But the terrible is normal and it's acceptable. We're not going to stress out about it. We're not going to change our training plan for it. We're not going to beat up on the dog. We're not going to beat up on the owner. We go, yeah, that's the way it is. But what's excellent will expand. Expand, expand, and expand. And what we'll end up with at the end is a dog that doesn't really remember all the difficulties it has. All of its most recent memories are of success. And we've engineered this in a way that even when we take the dog into a brand new environment, it has tremendous success. Not because it's already experienced this a whole bunch of times, but because again and again and again, the dog has succeeded in new things. We just made sure those new things were a small enough increment or even a step back. They were just new to the dog in circumstance, but in difficulty, they may have been a step back. So the dog did great with them. Imagine if we had 5 rooms down a hallway and our dog was afraid of going in new rooms. But the first room, before we took the dog there, we sprinkled a bunch of food in it. And we took the dog to see this room at a time it was pretty hungry. We take the dog in and we just hang out with it. We don't try to tell it anything. We don't try to do anything. Oh, the dog's got a nose, and maybe it's really unsettled for the first 5, 10, or 15 minutes. But eventually, it starts to go, yes, there's food in here. I think maybe I'll eat some. And it does. And then we have an assistant set up the next room exactly the same way. And we take our dog in there. Well, let's leave aside the fact the dog's eventually going to get full. So maybe we're talking about doing this over a series of days. Is the dog going to do better in the second room than the first? Well, sure. It's definitely going to do better. Because when it walks in and sees newness again, and it's freaked out by newness, it also goes, but there's food here too. And again, we don't put any burden on the dog. We're not telling the dog what to do. He's going to start searching for food. Well, by the time we get to the 7th room, the dog is going to be like, hey, let's go in that room. I can already smell under the door there's food in there, and I want to go in there and find it. Okay? Now, a lot of people are going to say, yeah, but isn't that the crappy to great pathway? Yes, it is to some degree, because sometimes in the beginning it's unavoidable. It may be that your easiest beginning point isn't all that easy because you have a very difficult dog. But we could now take this experience that we've created for the dog and we could use it in a whole lot of different things. Let's just say, as an example, one of the things we wanted to do was put our dog in a competition rally obedience class. Well, we know our dog is really stressed out by that. Well, we could, in the beginning, take the dog to that building when there's not a class going on, leave our dog in the car, get out of our car, drop a lot of food around the building for the dog, take the dog out and just go for a walk. Well, guess what? He's going to have a pretty good impression of that place, even though in the beginning he was afraid of new places. But through the thing we did through those 10 rooms, we built up this new emotional skill in him where he starts to expect good things in new places. We could maybe talk to the teacher about, is it possible that we could come in sometime when there are no dogs there, not even yours, and we could drop some food in and just let our dog come in and find the food? Well, how do you think the dog's going to do? Probably extremely well. This is the excellent to excellent pathway. We build skills that help the dog with its core emotional issues, and then we titrate or control for the challenge levels so that the dog can repeatedly have strong success. But we do that with an understanding that we live in the real world, and there are things that are way beyond our dog's grade school level, and the dog is going to fail at those. We try to minimize exposure to those, but most importantly, when we are exposed to those, we don't make us or the dog a failure. And as we move out of that circumstance, we, as quickly as possible, reconnect to some grade school level the dog can do really well at. So, that's why okay sucks, but terrible is normal and acceptable. And if you follow this idea, you can do extremely well with very difficult behavioral cases. Or if you want to go out and compete, you can do extremely well in competition, and especially do very well with new circumstances. Oh, we're not going to a trial that's in the training building we've always gone to, or we're not working on the same field or decoy that we've always worked on. If you understand this process and you harness it well, your dog will do extremely well with new things. And that's the most important thing. Not that the dog does well with everything it already knows, and it'll do well at this restaurant once it's been there 20 times. No, at some point, our dog has to do extremely well with new. And this is a pathway for getting there. In TBTE, We teach some more detailed and very clear structures for how to do this and how to make sure that you're in the right place for the dog and how to know what excellent is and what excellent is not. But hopefully from what we talked about today, you get enough of an idea that there is a different way of thinking about training. And by just adjusting the way that we approach training, regardless of the actual techniques we use, we can radically change the outcomes that we get for us and our dog. So I hope you find that helpful.